I'm Rebecca Turner, and at 28 years old, I came home from a business trip to find my brother's family living in my house. Not renting it, not house sitting, actually living there with their belongings moved in and my spare key in their possession. When I confronted my parents about this betrayal, they handed me a legal document that made my blood run cold. They had transferred the deed of my house to my brother without my knowledge or consent. What they didn't realize was that the paperwork they signed in their rush to favor their golden child would become the very weapon that would destroy their financial future forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I learned early that love in the Henderson household came with conditions and rankings. My parents, Frank and Patricia Henderson, had built their modest middle-class life around a set of traditional values that seemed to favor one gender over the other, in ways that would shape every major decision in our family's future. Frank worked as a regional sales manager for a paper company, bringing home a steady if unremarkable income that kept us comfortable in our split-level home in the suburbs. Patricia managed the household with military precision, but her real passion was invested in what she called family planning, not the kind involving birth control, but the kind that involved mapping out each of her children's futures according to her vision of how things should be. My brother Marcus was born 18 months after me, and from the moment he took his first breath, the hierarchy in our home became crystal clear. While I was expected to help with household chores from age 6, Marcus was encouraged to focus on his interests and hobbies. While I was told that good grades were simply expected and not worthy of special recognition, Marcus's mediocre report cards were celebrated as if he'd cured cancer. The earliest memory I have of recognizing this disparity was during Christmas when I was 8 years old. I had been saving my allowance for months to buy Marcus a remote-controlled car that I'd seen him admiring in store windows. When Christmas morning arrived, I proudly presented him with the gift, expecting perhaps some acknowledgement of my thoughtfulness. Instead, my parents beamed at Marcus's reaction and praised him for being such a good receiver of gifts, while my own presents, a generic craft kit and some books, were handed to me with casual disinterest. That same morning, Marcus gave me a drawing he'd made in school the previous week, something he'd clearly forgotten about until the last minute. My parents acted as if he'd painted the Sistine Chapel, going on about his natural artistic ability and how thoughtful he was to create something handmade. The irony wasn't lost on me, even at 8 years old. As we grew older, the favoritism became more sophisticated but no less obvious. When I expressed interest in joining the debate team in middle school, my parents worried about the time commitment and whether it would interfere with my responsibilities at home. When Marcus wanted to play football, a sport that required expensive equipment, regular travel, and significant time investment, they enthusiastically signed him up and began planning their schedules around his games. High school brought new challenges and new examples of the double standard that governed our household. I had developed a passion for computer programming, spending hours learning coding languages and building small applications. This was during the early days of the internet boom, and I could see the potential for a career in technology. My parents, however, dismissed this interest as playing with computers and suggested I focus on more practical subjects like business administration or teaching. Meanwhile, Marcus had discovered his love for music and wanted to pursue it professionally. Despite having no particular talent that I could discern, and I say this with the objectivity of someone who lived with his daily practice sessions, my parents immediately began researching music schools and discussing how they could support his artistic dreams. They bought him an expensive guitar, paid for private lessons, and even converted the garage into a practice studio. The college years brought the most glaring example of favoritism I'd experienced yet. When it came time to discuss higher education, my parents had already established a clear framework for how resources would be allocated. Marcus, being the creative one who would need to find himself, was given free rein to explore expensive private liberal arts colleges. They toured campuses with him, discussed dormitory options, and began planning how to fund his education through a combination of savings, loans, and sacrifices. For me, the conversation was markedly different. My parents suggested I consider the state university system, emphasizing practical majors that would lead to immediate employment. When I mentioned my interest in computer science, they worried about the competitiveness of the field and whether I'd be able to handle the technical demands. They encouraged me to have a backup plan, suggesting I double major in something more reliable, like accounting. The financial disparity was the most telling aspect of these discussions. While my parents had been setting aside money for Marcus's education since he was in elementary school, they had apparently assumed I would either receive scholarships or find a way to fund my own education. When I asked about this directly, my father explained that they had limited resources and needed to make strategic decisions about where to invest their money for the greatest return. The return they were expecting, it seemed, was grandchildren and the continuation of the Henderson family name. Marcus would need a good education to attract the right kind of wife and establish himself in a career that would allow him to support a family. I, on the other hand, would presumably marry someone who would take care of my financial needs, making my own education less critical to the family's long-term success. This reasoning might have made sense in 1950, but we were living in the 1990s. I watched my parents make these calculations with a mixture of disbelief and determination. If they weren't going to invest in my future, I would do it myself. I applied for every scholarship I could find, worked part-time jobs throughout high school, and saved every penny I could get my hands on. While Marcus was enjoying his carefree teenage years, I was building spreadsheets to track my college fund and researching the most cost-effective ways to get a quality education in computer science. The irony was that my parents' dismissal of my abilities and prospects was creating exactly the kind of drive and self-reliance that would serve me well in the tech industry. Every time they suggested I wasn't cut out for a challenging career, every time they implied that my future success was less important than Marcus's, I became more determined to prove them wrong. By my senior year of high school, I had secured enough scholarships and financial aid to attend a respected state university with a strong computer science program. My acceptance letter was met with polite congratulations from my parents, while Marcus's acceptance to an expensive private school was celebrated with a family dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. The pattern was so established by this point that I barely noticed the disparity anymore. What I did notice was how this differential treatment was shaping both Marcus and me in ways that would have long-term consequences for our family dynamics. Marcus was becoming increasingly entitled, expecting that his desires would be prioritized and his needs would be met without significant effort on his part. I was becoming increasingly independent, learning to rely on my own resources and judgment rather than seeking approval or support from my parents. These personality developments would prove crucial in the years to come, as the family dynamics we were establishing in adolescence would eventually determine how we each responded to the major crisis that would tear our family apart. Marcus's expectation of preferential treatment would lead him to make assumptions about what he was entitled to, while my hard-won independence would give me the tools to fight back when those assumptions threatened everything I had worked to build. Neither of us understood at the time that we were being shaped by forces that would eventually put us on opposite sides of a conflict that would change our family forever. The favoritism that seemed so natural and inevitable to my parents was actually laying the groundwork for the betrayal that would define our adult relationships, and ultimately cost them everything they thought they were protecting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. College became my escape hatch from the suffocating dynamics of the Henderson household. At Oregon State University, I was finally free to pursue my passion for computer science without constant questioning about whether I was really cut out for it. The late 1990s were an exciting time to be studying technology, with the internet revolution creating opportunities that my parents couldn't have imagined when they were discouraging my interest in playing with computers. My freshman year was a culture shock in the best possible way. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who evaluated me based on my abilities rather than my gender or my place in a family hierarchy. My professors were impressed by my coding skills and problem-solving abilities. My classmates sought me out for study groups and collaborative projects. I was finally being seen for who I was rather than who I wasn't compared to Marcus. The financial pressure was intense, but I had learned to thrive under pressure. While other students were calling home for money, or enjoying carefree college experiences funded by their parents, I was working 20 hours a week at the campus computer lab, tutoring other students in programming languages, and taking on freelance web development projects for local businesses. Every dollar I earned went toward tuition, books, and living expenses, with nothing left over for the social activities that defined college life for my peers. During my sophomore year, I landed an internship at a small software company in Portland that specialized in database management systems. The internship was unpaid, but it offered something more valuable than money: real-world experience and professional connections. I would drive the hour each way to Portland 3 times a week, working at the company during the day and attending my regular classes in the evenings. The owner of the company, a brilliant programmer named Sarah Chen, became an unexpected mentor. She had started her own tech company in the early 1990s, when few women were breaking into the industry at the executive level. She saw something in me that reminded her of her younger self, the hunger to prove that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle. "You have the instincts of an entrepreneur," Sarah told me during one of our late-night debugging sessions. "Have you ever thought about starting your own company?" The idea had never occurred to me. I had been so focused on proving I could succeed in the tech industry that I hadn't considered the possibility of creating my own opportunities rather than just pursuing existing ones. Sarah began sharing her experiences as a female entrepreneur, the challenges she had faced, and the strategies she had developed to build a successful business in a male-dominated field. Meanwhile, Marcus was having a very different college experience. He had enrolled at Whitman College, a prestigious liberal arts school in Washington state that cost nearly 3 times as much as my state university education. My parents had taken out substantial loans to cover his tuition and living expenses, viewing this investment as crucial to his future success. Marcus was majoring in music performance with a minor in business, a combination that my parents believed would give him the flexibility to pursue his artistic dreams while maintaining practical career options. He was living in a comfortable dormitory, eating in the dining halls, and participating in all the social activities that defined the traditional college experience. During our infrequent phone conversations, Marcus would tell me about his classes, his friends, and his involvement in various campus organizations. He seemed genuinely happy and was clearly thriving in an environment where his needs were met and his interests were supported. I was happy for him, but I couldn't help noticing the contrast between his experience and mine. When I mentioned my internship or described the projects I was working on, Marcus would listen politely but seemed to view my intense focus on career development as slightly obsessive. He would suggest that I was missing out on the real college experience, and that I should try to have more fun. It was clear that he didn't understand the financial pressure I was under, or the drive that was pushing me to excel. My parents' reactions to our respective college experiences were predictably different. When Marcus called home with stories about his classes, his professors, or his social activities, they would listen with genuine interest and ask follow-up questions about his experiences. When I shared news about my internship, my freelance projects, or my academic achievements, they would offer brief congratulations before steering the conversation toward more practical concerns about my expenses or my plans after graduation. The summer after my sophomore year, I made a decision that would prove to be one of the most important of my life. Instead of returning home to Portland, I stayed in the college town and worked full-time at a local tech startup that specialized in e-commerce solutions. The company was small, only 8 employees, but it was growing rapidly as more businesses recognized the potential of online sales. My role was officially junior developer, but in a startup environment, job titles were fluid. I found myself working on everything from database design to user interface development to client communications. The experience was invaluable, giving me exposure to every aspect of running a technology business. The salary was modest, but it allowed me to rent a small apartment near campus and live independently for the first time in my life. That summer of freedom was transformative. I could eat what I wanted, sleep when I wanted, and pursue my interests without anyone questioning my choices or suggesting that I should be focusing on something more appropriate for a young woman. I also began dating seriously for the first time. Throughout high school, I had been too busy with work and school to invest much time in relationships. The few boys I had dated seemed intimidated by my ambition and my clear sense of direction. In college, I met David Park, a fellow computer science major who shared my passion for technology and understood the drive that was pushing me to excel. David was the son of Korean immigrants who had started their own small business when they arrived in America. He understood the pressure to succeed and the importance of financial independence in ways that my previous boyfriends hadn't. We spent long hours together working on coding projects, discussing our career goals, and planning the kinds of lives we wanted to build for ourselves. When I told my parents about David during one of our rare phone conversations, their reaction was lukewarm at best. They asked about his major, his family background, and his plans after graduation, but their questions seemed focused on evaluating his potential as a provider, rather than understanding why I cared about him. When I explained that David was also passionate about technology and that we were working on some freelance projects together, my father seemed concerned that I was getting too serious about someone who shared my impractical interests. The contrast with their reaction to Marcus's girlfriend was stark. Marcus had been dating a music major named Jennifer since his freshman year, and my parents treated her like a prospective daughter-in-law from the moment they met her. They invited her to family gatherings, asked about her classes and her family, and seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, rather than just evaluating her suitability as a romantic partner. My junior year brought new challenges and new opportunities. I was selected for a competitive internship program at Intel, one of the major tech companies that was driving the innovation boom in the Pacific Northwest. The internship was paid, prestigious, and offered the possibility of a full-time job offer upon graduation. Working at Intel was like getting a masterclass in corporate technology development. I was part of a team working on processor efficiency improvements, and I was exposed to the cutting-edge research that was driving the next generation of computing power. My supervisor, a senior engineer named Michael Rodriguez, was impressed by my technical skills and my ability to think systematically about complex problems. "You have the analytical mind of a systems architect," Michael told me during my performance review. "Have you considered pursuing a graduate degree in computer engineering?" This suggestion opened up possibilities I hadn't considered. Graduate school would mean more education expenses, but it would also mean access to advanced research opportunities and the kind of specialized knowledge that could lead to senior positions at major tech companies. I began researching graduate programs and exploring options for funding my continued education. At the same time, I was also developing the business skills that would prove crucial in my future success. The freelance work I had been doing throughout college had grown into a small but profitable side business. I was designing websites and database systems for local businesses, and I was learning how to manage client relationships, set pricing, and deliver projects on time and within budget. By my senior year, I had saved enough money to make a down payment on a small condo near campus. The real estate market in college towns was strong, and I saw the purchase as both a smart investment and a step toward the kind of financial independence that had always been my goal. The condo was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that was popular with graduate students and young professionals. But it was mine, purchased with money I had earned and saved through 4 years of relentless work and careful financial planning. For the first time in my life, I owned something substantial, something that represented the success I had built through my own efforts. When I told my parents about the purchase, their reaction was mixed. My father seemed concerned about the debt I was taking on and questioned whether I was ready for the responsibility of homeownership. My mother worried about me living alone and suggested that I might be better off renting until I got married and could buy a house with my future husband. Neither of them seemed to understand that the condo represented more than just a place to live. It was proof that their predictions about my future had been wrong. I wasn't going to need a husband to take care of me financially. I was building a career and a life that could provide for all of my needs and wants. The purchase also represented something deeper. My final step away from the family dynamics that had shaped my childhood and adolescence. I was no longer the daughter who needed to prove she was worthy of investment and support. I was an adult with my own resources, my own goals, and my own power to make decisions about my future. What I didn't realize at the time was that this success would eventually threaten the family structure that my parents had worked so hard to maintain. My independence was about to become a problem that they would attempt to solve in ways that would ultimately destroy the very thing they thought they were protecting. Graduation day arrived with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. I had completed my degree in computer science with honors, landed a full-time position at Intel starting at a salary that was higher than what my father made after 20 years in sales, and been accepted into a part-time graduate program that would allow me to work toward my master's degree while gaining professional experience. By any objective measure, I had exceeded every expectation anyone could have had for my future. The job at Intel was everything I had hoped for and more. I was part of a team developing next-generation processor architectures, working alongside some of the brightest minds in the technology industry. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, and positioned me at the forefront of technological innovation that was reshaping the global economy. My starting salary was $75,000, a figure that seemed astronomical to me after years of living on ramen noodles and part-time wages. For the first time in my life, I had genuine financial security. I could afford to eat at restaurants, buy clothes that weren't from thrift stores, and even take occasional vacations. The freedom was intoxicating. More importantly, I was building expertise in an area that was becoming increasingly valuable. The internet boom was creating unprecedented demand for skilled programmers and systems architects, and my combination of technical skills and business acumen made me particularly valuable to employers. Within 6 months of starting at Intel, I had received 2 job offers from competing companies, each offering substantial salary increases. I decided to stay at Intel for the learning opportunities and the prestige, but the external interest in my skills gave me confidence in my market value. I was building a career that would provide long-term financial security and professional fulfillment, exactly the kind of success that my parents had always said was important for their children's futures. Meanwhile, Marcus was having a very different post-graduation experience. He had completed his degree in music performance, but the transition from college to the professional world had been jarring. The music industry, it turned out, was not particularly interested in hiring recent graduates with bachelor's degrees in music performance, regardless of how prestigious their college had been. Marcus had spent his senior year applying for positions with orchestras, music schools, and recording studios, but the rejections had been consistent and demoralizing. The few opportunities that were available were either unpaid internships or part-time positions that barely covered living expenses. The comfortable lifestyle that had defined his college years was no longer sustainable without parental support. He had moved back into my parents' house after graduation, an arrangement that was supposed to be temporary while he established his career. My parents had been understanding and supportive, encouraging him to pursue his dreams while providing the financial cushion that would allow him to be selective about opportunities. They continued to pay for his car insurance, his cell phone, and his other expenses, while he searched for the right position. The contrast between our post-graduation experiences was stark, but it wasn't immediately apparent to our parents. They saw Marcus's struggles as temporary setbacks that were natural for someone pursuing an artistic career, while they viewed my success as somewhat unexpected and possibly temporary. They seemed to assume that my high salary was an anomaly that wouldn't last once the tech industry settled down to more normal levels. During family dinners, the conversation would often focus on Marcus's job search and the challenges he was facing in the music industry. My parents would offer advice, share networking contacts, and brainstorm strategies for breaking into the field. When the conversation turned to my work, they would listen politely but seemed to view my technical explanations as incomprehensible and my career trajectory as somehow less meaningful than Marcus's artistic pursuits. The first crack in this dynamic appeared about a year after graduation. Marcus had been living at home for 12 months, and his job search had yielded only occasional freelance gigs and part-time teaching positions at local music schools. His income was sporadic and insufficient to support independent living, let alone the kind of comfortable lifestyle he had enjoyed in college. At the same time, I had been promoted to senior systems analyst and was earning $95,000 annually. I had also expanded my freelance business, taking on larger projects for clients who were willing to pay premium rates for high-quality work. My total income was approaching 6 figures, and I was saving substantial amounts each month toward my long-term financial goals. I had also made the decision to upgrade my living situation. The condo I had purchased in college had appreciated significantly in value, and I was ready to move to something larger and more suitable for my professional status. I found a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a desirable neighborhood in Portland, complete with a home office, a modern kitchen, and a garage for the car I had finally been able to afford. The house was expensive, $350,000, which was a significant amount for a single person in the late 1990s, but my income could comfortably support the mortgage payments, and the purchase represented another step toward the kind of financial independence that had always been my goal. When I told my parents about the house purchase, their reaction was more complex than I had expected. My father seemed concerned about the size of the mortgage and questioned whether I was taking on too much debt. My mother worried about me living alone in such a large house and suggested that I might be getting ahead of myself in terms of lifestyle choices. But underneath their concerns, I could sense something else. A growing discomfort with the reversal of expectations that was occurring in our family. Marcus, who had always been positioned as the future success story, was struggling to launch his career and was still dependent on parental support. I, who had been expected to need a husband for financial security, was building wealth and independence at a pace that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The family dynamics began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. During family gatherings, my parents would sometimes make comments about my good fortune in landing such a well-paying job, as if my success was primarily due to luck rather than years of hard work and strategic planning. They would also express concern about my materialistic focus and suggest that I was prioritizing career advancement over more important things like relationships and family. These comments stung because they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations and achievements. I wasn't pursuing financial success out of greed or materialism. I was building the kind of security and independence that would allow me to make choices about my future based on my own values and goals, rather than external constraints. The situation became more complicated when Marcus began dating Jennifer Morrison, a fellow music major who had also graduated without immediate job prospects. Jennifer was a lovely person, but she came from a family that had always provided extensive financial support for her pursuits. She expected to continue receiving that support even after graduation, and she encouraged Marcus to do the same. Jennifer's influence on Marcus was noticeable and concerning. She reinforced his belief that his parents should continue supporting him while he pursued his artistic dreams, and she seemed to view my success as somehow threatening to their relationship. During family gatherings, she would make comments about how lucky I was to have found such a lucrative career, implying that my achievements were primarily due to chance rather than effort. More problematically, Jennifer began encouraging Marcus to view my success as a family resource that should be shared more equitably. She would suggest that I could help Marcus with his expenses, or that I could use my professional connections to help him find opportunities in the music industry. These suggestions were presented as reasonable requests for family support, but they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both my career path and my financial obligations. The tension came to a head during Christmas of my second year at Intel. Marcus and Jennifer had been dating for over a year, and Jennifer had essentially moved into my parents' house while she pursued her own job search. The three of them had developed a comfortable routine where my parents provided financial support, while Marcus and Jennifer explored their artistic interests without the pressure of immediate economic necessity. During Christmas dinner, the conversation turned to future plans and family goals. Marcus announced that he and Jennifer were planning to get married in the spring, and my parents immediately began discussing how they could help with wedding expenses and support the couple as they started their life together. The assumption seemed to be that Marcus and Jennifer would continue living with my parents after marriage, at least temporarily, while they established their careers. My parents appeared to be planning for a long-term arrangement where they would provide ongoing financial support for the couple's living expenses, transportation, and other needs. When I asked about the financial implications of this arrangement, my father explained that they were prepared to make sacrifices to support Marcus's career development. He suggested that artistic careers required longer development periods, and that it was important for parents to provide stability during this crucial phase. The conversation then turned to my situation, and my parents began discussing how I could contribute to the family's financial stability. They suggested that since I was doing so well professionally, I could help with Marcus's expenses or contribute to the wedding costs. The assumption seemed to be that my success created an obligation to support other family members who were less fortunate. This expectation revealed a fundamental shift in how my parents viewed my role in the family. Instead of being the daughter who needed to find a husband for financial security, I had become the family member who was expected to provide financial security for others. My success had created new expectations and obligations that I had never agreed to, and that seemed to undermine the independence I had worked so hard to achieve. The conversation left me feeling frustrated and confused. I had spent years building a career and establishing financial independence, only to discover that my family now viewed my success as a resource that should be shared according to their priorities rather than my own. The reversal of expectations was complete, but it came with new pressures and obligations that I was not prepared to accept. What I didn't realize at the time was that this Christmas dinner conversation was setting the stage for a much larger conflict that would ultimately threaten everything I had built. My parents' willingness to sacrifice for Marcus's dreams was about to extend beyond their own resources to include mine, whether I agreed to it or not. The months following that Christmas dinner marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a systematic campaign to reshape my understanding of family obligations. My parents, influenced by Jennifer's constant presence and Marcus's growing frustration with his career struggles, began treating my financial success as a family asset rather than a personal achievement. The pressure started subtly. During our weekly phone calls, my mother would casually mention Marcus's latest job rejection or the stress he was experiencing trying to find stable employment. She would then pivot to asking about my work, but her questions seemed designed to gather information about my income and savings rather than show genuine interest in my professional development. "You're doing so well for yourself, Rebecca," she would say with a tone that somehow made success sound like a burden. "It must be nice to have such security when others in the family are struggling." These conversations always left me feeling guilty and defensive. I had worked incredibly hard to achieve my success, but my mother's comments made it seem as if my achievements were somehow taking away from Marcus's opportunities. The implication was that there was a finite amount of success available to the Henderson family, and my portion was preventing Marcus from getting his fair share. My father's approach was more direct. During one of my visits home, he sat me down for what he called a, quote, serious conversation about family responsibilities. He explained that Marcus was at a crucial point in his career development and needed support to reach his potential. He suggested that I could help by providing financial assistance for Marcus's living expenses, allowing him to focus on his music without the distraction of financial stress. "You've been blessed with opportunities that Marcus hasn't had," my father said, using language that made my career success sound like a lottery win, rather than the result of years of strategic planning and hard work. "With blessing comes responsibility to help those who haven't been as fortunate." The conversation was carefully structured to make me feel selfish for questioning these expectations. My father painted a picture of family members supporting each other through difficult times, with those who had more helping those who had less. He used examples of extended family members who had made sacrifices for each other, creating a narrative where refusing to help Marcus would make me the villain in our family story. I tried to explain that my success hadn't been a matter of luck or blessing, but rather the result of deliberate choices I had made about my education, career, and financial planning. I pointed out that Marcus had received significantly more family support throughout his education and early career than I had ever received, but my father seemed to view these facts as irrelevant to the current situation. "The past is the past," he said dismissively. "What matters now is how we support each other moving forward." The pressure intensified when Marcus and Jennifer's wedding plans began taking shape. The ceremony was scheduled for June, and my parents were committed to paying for a celebration that would give the couple the kind of wedding they had always dreamed of. The budget they were discussing was substantial, more than what many people spend on a car, and it was clear that covering these expenses would strain their finances significantly. During the wedding planning discussions, Jennifer made several comments about how I could contribute to making the celebration more special. She suggested that I could pay for the honeymoon, cover the cost of the reception bar, or hire a professional photographer as my gift to the couple. These suggestions were presented as reasonable requests, but they involved expenses that were far beyond what most people would consider appropriate for a sister's wedding contribution. When I explained that I had already planned to give them a generous cash gift, Jennifer seemed disappointed. She made comments about how different our financial situations were, and how lucky I was to have such a well-paying job. She suggested that since I didn't have the expenses of planning a wedding or starting a family, I should be able to contribute more to their celebration. The wedding planning also revealed the extent to which my parents were willing to sacrifice their own financial stability to support Marcus's dreams. They had taken out a loan against their house to cover the wedding expenses, and they were planning to refinance their mortgage to provide ongoing support for Marcus and Jennifer after the marriage. When I learned about these financial arrangements, I was deeply concerned. My parents were in their 50s, and taking on additional debt at this stage of their lives could jeopardize their retirement security. I tried to discuss these concerns with them, but they brushed off my worries and insisted that supporting their children's happiness was more important than their own financial comfort. The wedding itself was a beautiful celebration, but it was also a stark reminder of the different expectations and standards that applied to Marcus and me. The ceremony was elegant and expensive, with every detail carefully planned and executed. My parents beamed with pride as they watched Marcus and Jennifer exchange vows, and they seemed genuinely happy to have been able to provide such a special day for their son. During the reception, several family members made comments about how successful I had become and how proud my parents must be of my achievements. But these comments were often followed by suggestions about how I could use my success to help other family members. The assumption seemed to be that my financial independence created an obligation to serve as a safety net for the entire extended family. After the wedding, Marcus and Jennifer moved into a small apartment that my parents helped them rent. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary while Marcus established his music career, but it quickly became clear that the couple was struggling to make ends meet on their combined income from part-time music teaching and occasional performances. My parents began covering not just the rent but also utilities, groceries, and other living expenses for the couple. They justified these expenditures as an investment in Marcus's future, but I could see the strain it was putting on their own finances. They had begun making minimum payments on their credit cards and had stopped contributing to their retirement savings. The situation reached a crisis point about 6 months after the wedding. Marcus had been offered a position as a music director at a small church in Seattle, which would provide steady income and benefits. However, the salary was modest, and the couple would need to relocate to a city where housing costs were significantly higher than what they were currently paying. During a family meeting to discuss this opportunity, my parents revealed that they had been researching houses in Seattle and had found a small starter home that would be perfect for Marcus and Jennifer. The price was $280,000, which was beyond what the couple could afford on Marcus's church salary, but my parents were prepared to help with the down payment and co-sign the mortgage. This is where the conversation took a turn that shocked me. My father explained that they didn't have enough liquid assets to cover the down payment, but they had been discussing various options for raising the necessary funds. One option was to take out a second mortgage on their own home, but they were concerned about the additional debt burden. Then he presented what he called a, quote, creative solution. He suggested that since I had built significant equity in my Portland house, I could either sell it and help Marcus with his down payment, or I could take out a home equity loan and provide the funds that way. He presented this as a win-win situation where I would be helping my brother achieve homeownership while also making a sound financial investment. The suggestion was so outrageous that I initially thought he was joking. When I realized he was serious, I struggled to find words to respond. The idea that I should liquidate my own assets to help Marcus buy a house was beyond anything I had imagined they might ask of me. I explained that my house was my primary residence and my largest financial asset. Taking out a home equity loan would put my own financial security at risk, and selling the house would disrupt my life and career in ways that made no sense. I pointed out that Marcus had received far more family financial support than I had ever received, and that asking me to sacrifice my own homeownership to help him achieve his was fundamentally unfair. My father's response revealed the depth of his conviction that my success created obligations to the family. He argued that since I was single and had no dependents, I had more flexibility to take financial risks. He suggested that I could find a smaller, less expensive place to live, and that the sacrifice would be temporary since my high income would allow me to recover quickly. You'll have other opportunities to buy houses, he said, as if real estate was an unlimited resource. Marcus may never have another chance like this. The conversation ended with me firmly refusing to consider any arrangement that would jeopardize my own financial security. But I could see the disappointment and frustration in my parents' faces. They had clearly been counting on my cooperation, and my refusal had created a problem they weren't prepared to solve. Over the following weeks, the pressure campaign intensified. My parents began making more frequent comments about family loyalty and mutual support. They would share stories about other families where successful children had helped their siblings achieve their dreams. They would express concern about my selfishness and suggest that my focus on personal financial security was preventing me from seeing the bigger picture of family happiness. Jennifer joined the campaign with her own approach. She would call me directly to discuss Marcus's career prospects and their housing needs. She would describe their living situation in terms that made it sound desperate. even though they were living comfortably in an apartment that my parents were paying for. She would then suggest that I had the power to change their circumstances and improve their quality of life. The most manipulative aspect of this campaign was how it reframed my refusal to help as a character flaw. Instead of acknowledging that I had legitimate reasons for protecting my own financial security, my family members began treating my position as evidence that I was selfish, materialistic, and lacking in family values. This narrative was particularly painful because it contradicted everything I had worked to achieve. I had spent years building financial independence specifically so that I could make choices based on my own values and goals. Now my family was using that independence against me, suggesting that my success created an obligation to abandon my own priorities in favor of theirs. What I didn't realize at the time was that this pressure campaign was just the beginning. My parents' frustration with my refusal to help Marcus was about to lead them to take actions that would bypass my consent entirely and put everything I had worked for at risk. The opportunity to attend the International Technology Conference in Tokyo came at what seemed like the perfect time. Intel was sending a small team of senior engineers to present our latest research on processor architecture, and I had been selected to represent our division. The conference was scheduled for 2 weeks in March, and it represented a significant milestone in my career: international recognition of my technical expertise and leadership potential. The timing couldn't have been better from a personal perspective either. The constant pressure from my family about Marcus's housing situation had become emotionally exhausting. Every conversation seemed to circle back to their financial struggles and my supposed obligation to help solve them. A 2-week break in Tokyo would give me space to think clearly about how to handle the situation without the daily guilt trips and manipulation tactics. In the weeks leading up to the trip, I threw myself into preparation. I was scheduled to present a technical paper on energy-efficient computing systems, and I wanted to make sure the presentation would showcase both my individual expertise and Intel's innovation leadership. The conference would bring together some of the most brilliant minds in technology from around the world, and I saw it as an opportunity to expand my professional network and learn about emerging trends that could shape my future career path. My parents seemed unusually supportive of the trip when I mentioned it during one of our family dinners. My father asked detailed questions about the conference agenda and the other companies that would be represented. My mother expressed pride in my selection for such an important assignment and suggested that the international exposure would be valuable for my career development. Their positive reaction was so different from their usual lukewarm response to my professional achievements that I should have been suspicious. But I was focused on trip preparation and relieved to have a break from the constant pressure about Marcus's situation. I interpreted their support as a sign that they were finally beginning to appreciate the significance of my career success. The week before my departure, I had lunch with David, who had become my closest confidant during this difficult period with my family. We had been dating for over 3 years, and he understood both my professional ambitions and the complex dynamics of my family relationships. He had been supportive during the months of pressure from my parents, offering perspective and encouragement when I questioned my decision to resist their demands. "You're doing the right thing," he assured me as we discussed the ongoing family tension. "Your parents are asking you to sacrifice your financial security for Marcus's convenience. That's not fair, and it's not sustainable." David had grown up in a family where financial independence was valued, and where parents expected their children to build their own success rather than relying on family resources. His perspective helped me maintain clarity about the unreasonableness of my parents' expectations, even when their manipulation tactics made me question my own judgment. During that lunch, I made a decision that would later prove crucial. I told David about my concerns regarding my parents' access to my personal information and financial accounts. Over the years, I had given them emergency contact information and had occasionally asked them to check on my house when I was traveling for work. I had also shared some details about my mortgage and insurance policies during casual conversations about home ownership. "I'm probably being paranoid," I told David, "but I'm worried that they might try to interfere with my finances while I'm gone. They've been so fixated on my house equity that I'm concerned they might try to access my accounts or contact my mortgage company." David suggested that I take some precautionary steps before leaving for Tokyo. I contacted my bank and mortgage company to add password protection to my accounts and to ensure that no changes could be made without my direct authorization. I also arranged for David to check on my house regularly while I was away, and I gave him permission to contact me immediately if anything seemed unusual. These precautions seemed excessive at the time, but they reflected my growing awareness that my parents' desperation about Marcus's situation was leading them to consider actions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The pressure campaign had revealed a side of my parents that I had never seen before, a willingness to manipulate and guilt-trip me in ways that felt fundamentally dishonest. The flight to Tokyo was long, but gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my family relationships had changed over the past year. The daughter who had once been dismissed as unlikely to succeed had become the target of intense pressure to use her success for others' benefit. The independence I had worked so hard to achieve was being treated as a family resource rather than a personal accomplishment. The conference itself was everything I had hoped it would be. The technical presentations were cutting edge, and I had the opportunity to meet researchers and executives from companies around the world. My own presentation was well received, and I had several conversations with potential future employers who were impressed by my expertise and communication skills. More importantly, the international perspective helped me see my family situation more clearly. The conference attendees came from many different cultural backgrounds, but they all shared a common understanding that professional success required individual dedication and sacrifice. No one suggested that my achievements created obligations to financially support adult siblings, and several colleagues expressed admiration for my independence and career focus. On the fourth day of the conference, I received a call from David that changed everything. It was early morning in Tokyo, which meant it was late evening in Portland. David's voice was tense and urgent in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "Rebecca, something's wrong at your house," he said without preamble. "I drove by this morning like we planned, and there are people living there. A moving truck was parked outside yesterday, and now there are unfamiliar cars in your driveway." My first thought was that there had been a break-in or some kind of mistake. I asked David to describe what he had seen, hoping there might be a logical explanation. But his description made it clear that this wasn't a random crime or a misunderstanding. "It looks like a family has moved in," he continued. "There are children's toys in the yard, and I saw a woman hanging laundry on the line behind your house. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her until I realized it was Jennifer." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer was living in my house. Marcus and Jennifer had somehow moved into my home while I was in Tokyo. The implications were staggering, but I couldn't immediately understand how this was possible. "Have you tried calling your parents?" David asked. I hadn't spoken to my parents since leaving for Tokyo, which was unusual for me during extended business trips. I had been so focused on the conference that I hadn't noticed the absence of their usual check-in calls. Now their silence seemed ominous rather than simply respectful of my busy schedule. I called my parents' house immediately, but the phone rang without answer. I tried their cell phones with the same result. Finally, I called Marcus's number, and he answered on the second ring. "Rebecca," he said with forced cheerfulness. "How's Tokyo?" "Marcus, what are you doing in my house?" I asked directly. There was a long pause before he responded. "We can explain everything when you get back. Mom and Dad wanted to talk to you about it, but they thought it would be better to discuss it in person." "Discuss what, Marcus? How did you get into my house?" "Look, I know this seems strange, but Mom and Dad have been working on a solution that benefits everyone. They found a way to help us with our housing situation while also taking care of some tax issues you were going to have with your property." His explanation was vague and confusing, but it was clear that my parents had orchestrated whatever was happening. They had used my absence to implement some kind of plan that involved Marcus and Jennifer moving into my house without my knowledge or consent. "I need to speak to Mom and Dad immediately," I said. "They're not available right now," Marcus replied. "They're meeting with some lawyers about the paperwork. But Rebecca, I want you to know that this is going to work out great for everyone. You won't have to worry about mortgage payments or property taxes anymore, and Jennifer and I will have the stability we need to start our family." The conversation ended with Marcus promising that everything would be explained when I returned from Tokyo. But his words had revealed enough for me to understand that this wasn't a temporary house-sitting arrangement. My parents had somehow transferred ownership or control of my house to Marcus and Jennifer while I was out of the country. The rest of the conference was a blur. I tried to focus on the technical presentations and networking opportunities, but my mind was consumed by trying to understand what had happened and how to respond. I spent hours on the phone with David, trying to piece together the situation and explore options for addressing it. David drove by the house several more times during the remainder of my trip, and his reports confirmed that Marcus and Jennifer had fully moved in. They had replaced the locks, changed the landscaping, and were clearly treating the property as their permanent residence. More disturbing, they had also installed a security system and posted no trespassing signs that suggested they were preparing for conflict. I tried repeatedly to reach my parents, but they seemed to be deliberately avoiding my calls. When I finally managed to reach my mother on the day before my return flight, her explanation was brief and defensive. "We found a legal way to help Marcus that also protects your interests," she said. "The lawyers assured us that everything is proper and that you'll understand once you see the paperwork." "What paperwork, Mom? What did you sign?" "We'll explain everything when you get home. But Rebecca, you need to understand that we did this for the good of the whole family. Marcus and Jennifer needed stability, and you had more house than you needed for just one person." The conversation ended with my mother insisting that I would be grateful for their intervention once I understood the full situation. But her words revealed the fundamental assumption that had guided their actions. My success and my property were family resources to be allocated according to their priorities rather than my own. As I boarded the plane for the long flight back to Portland, I realized that my parents had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They had used my absence to take control of my most valuable asset without my consent. Whatever legal mechanism they had used, their actions represented a betrayal that would fundamentally change our family relationships forever. What I didn't yet understand was that the paperwork they had signed would ultimately become their biggest mistake, a legal trap that would cost them far more than they had ever imagined when they decided to prioritize Marcus's needs over my rights. The opportunity to attend the International Technology Conference in Tokyo came at what seemed like the perfect time. Intel was sending a small team of senior engineers to present our latest research on processor architecture, and I had been selected to represent our division. The conference was scheduled for 2 weeks in March, and it represented a significant milestone in my career: international recognition of my technical expertise and leadership potential. The timing couldn't have been better from a personal perspective either. The constant pressure from my family about Marcus's housing situation had become emotionally exhausting. Every conversation seemed to circle back to their financial struggles and my supposed obligation to help solve them. A 2-week break in Tokyo would give me space to think clearly about how to handle the situation without the daily guilt trips and manipulation tactics. In the weeks leading up to the trip, I threw myself into preparation. I was scheduled to present a technical paper on energy-efficient computing systems, and I wanted to make sure the presentation would showcase both my individual expertise and Intel's innovation leadership. The conference would bring together some of the most brilliant minds in technology from around the world, and I saw it as an opportunity to expand my professional network and learn about emerging trends that could shape my future career path. My parents seemed unusually supportive of the trip when I mentioned it during one of our family dinners. My father asked detailed questions about the conference agenda and the other companies that would be represented. My mother expressed pride in my selection for such an important assignment and suggested that the international exposure would be valuable for my career development. Their positive reaction was so different from their usual lukewarm response to my professional achievements that I should have been suspicious. But I was focused on trip preparation and relieved to have a break from the constant pressure about Marcus's situation. I interpreted their support as a sign that they were finally beginning to appreciate the significance of my career success. The week before my departure, I had lunch with David, who had become my closest confidant during this difficult period with my family. We had been dating for over 3 years, and he understood both my professional ambitions and the complex dynamics of my family relationships. He had been supportive during the months of pressure from my parents, offering perspective and encouragement when I questioned my decision to resist their demands. "You're doing the right thing," he assured me as we discussed the ongoing family tension. "Your parents are asking you to sacrifice your financial security for Marcus's convenience. That's not fair, and it's not sustainable." David had grown up in a family where financial independence was valued, and where parents expected their children to build their own success rather than relying on family resources. His perspective helped me maintain clarity about the unreasonableness of my parents' expectations, even when their manipulation tactics made me question my own judgment. During that lunch, I made a decision that would later prove crucial. I told David about my concerns regarding my parents' access to my personal information and financial accounts. Over the years, I had given them emergency contact information and had occasionally asked them to check on my house when I was traveling for work. I had also shared some details about my mortgage and insurance policies during casual conversations about home ownership. I'm probably being paranoid, I told David, but I'm worried that they might try to interfere with my finances while I'm gone. They've been so fixated on my house equity that I'm concerned they might try to access my accounts or contact my mortgage company. David suggested that I take some precautionary steps before leaving for Tokyo. I contacted my bank and mortgage company to add password protection to my accounts and to ensure that no changes could be made without my direct authorization. I also arranged for David to check on my house regularly while I was away, and I gave him permission to contact me immediately if anything seemed unusual. These precautions seemed excessive at the time, but they reflected my growing awareness that my parents' desperation about Marcus's situation was leading them to consider actions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The pressure campaign had revealed a side of my parents that I had never seen before, a willingness to manipulate and guilt-trip me in ways that felt fundamentally dishonest. The flight to Tokyo was long but gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my family relationships had changed over the past year. The daughter who had once been dismissed as unlikely to succeed had become the target of intense pressure to use her success for others' benefit. The independence I had worked so hard to achieve was being treated as a family resource rather than a personal accomplishment. The conference itself was everything I had hoped it would be. The technical presentations were cutting edge, and I had the opportunity to meet researchers and executives from companies around the world. My own presentation was well received, and I had several conversations with potential future employers who were impressed by my expertise and communication skills. More importantly, the international perspective helped me see my family situation more clearly. The conference attendees came from many different cultural backgrounds, but they all shared a common understanding that professional success required individual dedication and sacrifice. No one suggested that my achievements created obligations to financially support adult siblings, and several colleagues expressed admiration for my independence and career focus. On the fourth day of the conference, I received a call from David that changed everything. It was early morning in Tokyo, which meant it was late evening in Portland. David's voice was tense and urgent in a way that immediately put me on high alert. "Rebecca, something's wrong at your house," he said without preamble. "I drove by this morning like we planned, and there are people living there. A moving truck was parked outside yesterday, and now there are unfamiliar cars in your driveway." My first thought was that there had been a break-in, or some kind of mistake. I asked David to describe what he had seen, hoping there might be a logical explanation. But his description made it clear that this wasn't a random crime or a misunderstanding. Quote, "It looks like a family has moved in," he continued. "There are children's toys in the yard, and I saw a woman hanging laundry on the line behind your house. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her until I realized it was Jennifer." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer was living in my house. Marcus and Jennifer had somehow moved into my home while I was in Tokyo. The implications were staggering, but I couldn't immediately understand how this was possible. "Have you tried calling your parents?" David asked. I hadn't spoken to my parents since leaving for Tokyo, which was unusual for me during extended business trips. I had been so focused on the conference that I hadn't noticed the absence of their usual check-in calls. Now their silence seemed ominous, rather than simply respectful of my busy schedule. I called my parents' house immediately, but the phone rang without answer. I tried their cell phones with the same result. Finally, I called Marcus's number, and he answered on the second ring. "Rebecca," he said with forced cheerfulness. "How's Tokyo?" "Marcus, what are you doing in my house?" I asked directly. There was a long pause before he responded. "We can explain everything when you get back. Mom and Dad wanted to talk to you about it, but they thought it would be better to discuss it in person." "Discuss what, Marcus? How did you get into my house?" "Look, I know this seems strange, but Mom and Dad have been working on a solution that benefits everyone. They found a way to help us with our housing situation while also taking care of some tax issues you were going to have with your property." His explanation was vague and confusing, but it was clear that my parents had orchestrated whatever was happening. They had used my absence to implement some kind of plan that involved Marcus and Jennifer moving into my house without my knowledge or consent. I need to speak to Mom and Dad immediately, I said. They're not available right now, Marcus replied. They're meeting with some lawyers about the paperwork. But Rebecca, I want you to know that this is going to work out great for everyone. You won't have to worry about mortgage payments or property taxes anymore. And Jennifer and I will have the stability we need to start our family. The conversation ended with Marcus promising that everything would be explained when I returned from Tokyo. But his words had revealed enough for me to understand that this wasn't a temporary house-sitting arrangement. My parents had somehow transferred ownership or control of my house to Marcus and Jennifer while I was out of the country. The rest of the conference was a blur. I tried to focus on the technical presentations and networking opportunities, but my mind was consumed by trying to understand what had happened and how to respond. I spent hours on the phone with David, trying to piece together the situation and explore options for addressing it. David drove by the house several more times during the remainder of my trip, and his reports confirmed that Marcus and Jennifer had fully moved in. They had replaced the locks, changed the landscaping, and were clearly treating the property as their permanent residence. More disturbing, they had also installed a security system and posted no trespassing signs that suggested they were preparing for conflict. I tried repeatedly to reach my parents, but they seemed to be deliberately avoiding my calls. When I finally managed to reach my mother on the day before my return flight, her explanation was brief and defensive. We found a legal way to help Marcus that also protects your interests, she said. The lawyers assured us that everything is proper and that you'll understand once you see the paperwork. What paperwork, Mom? What did you sign? We'll explain everything when you get home. But Rebecca, you need to understand that we did this for the good of the whole family. Marcus and Jennifer needed stability, and you had more house than you needed for just one person. The conversation ended with my mother insisting that I would be grateful for their intervention once I understood the full situation. But her words revealed the fundamental assumption that had guided their actions. My success and my property were family resources to be allocated according to their priorities rather than my own. As I boarded the plane for the long flight back to Portland, I realized that my parents had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They had used my absence to take control of my most valuable asset without my consent. Whatever legal mechanism they had used, their actions represented a betrayal that would fundamentally change our family relationships forever. What I didn't yet understand was that the paperwork they had signed would ultimately become their biggest mistake, a legal trap that would cost them far more than they had ever imagined when they decided to prioritize Marcus's needs over my rights. The Monday morning after my return from Tokyo, I was sitting in the office of Catherine Walsh, one of Portland's most respected real estate attorneys. David had researched lawyers specializing in property fraud cases, and Catherine's name had come up repeatedly as someone who didn't just win cases. She destroyed people who thought they could manipulate the legal system for personal gain. Catherine was in her early 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through any attempt at deception. She had built her reputation by taking on complex fraud cases that other lawyers avoided, and she had a particular talent for unraveling sophisticated schemes that appeared legal on the surface but were fundamentally corrupt. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over," Catherine said, spreading the paperwork across her mahogany desk. "This is one of the more brazen cases of family fraud I've encountered. Your parents didn't just steal your house. They created a multi-layered financial crime that they apparently thought you wouldn't be able to challenge." Catherine explained that my parents had made several critical errors in their scheme, errors that would ultimately become their downfall. The first mistake was their misuse of the power of attorney document. Medical powers of attorney are specifically limited to healthcare decisions and cannot be used for property transfers except under very specific circumstances that clearly didn't apply to my situation. The lawyer they worked with either didn't understand the limitations of the document or he was complicit in the fraud, Catherine said. Either way, the property transfer is legally invalid. The second mistake was more complex but potentially even more damaging to my parents. When they refinanced the mortgage to extract equity from my house, they had committed mortgage fraud by representing themselves as having the authority to encumber the property. The bank that had approved the refinancing had done so based on fraudulent documentation, which made both the loan and the property transfer vulnerable to legal challenge. "Your parents have potentially committed federal crimes," Catherine explained. "Mortgage fraud is a felony that can result in prison time, and the amounts involved here are substantial enough to trigger serious federal penalties. But the most devastating mistake my parents had made was their assumption that I wouldn't fight back. They had structured their scheme based on the belief that family loyalty would prevent me from pursuing legal action against them. They had counted on my reluctance to destroy family relationships, and they had gambled that I would eventually accept their theft rather than engage in a prolonged legal battle. "They've underestimated you," Catherine said with a slight smile, "and that's going to cost them everything." Catherine outlined a multi-pronged legal strategy that would not only reclaim my property, but would also ensure that my parents faced serious consequences for their actions. The first step was to file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office, documenting the fraud and requesting a full investigation. The second step was to initiate a civil lawsuit seeking not just the return of my property, but also damages for the financial harm I had suffered. "We're also going to file an emergency motion to freeze all of your parents' assets," Catherine said. "They've used the equity from your house to pay off your brother's debts and establish this so-called family trust. We need to prevent them from dissipating those funds before we can recover them." The third element of our strategy was perhaps the most important. We were going to expose the full extent of my parents' financial manipulation. Catherine had connections with forensic accountants who specialized in tracing complex financial transactions, and she was confident that we would find evidence of other questionable activities. "People who commit this kind of fraud rarely do it just once," Catherine explained. "We're going to dig into their entire financial history and see what other schemes they've been running." Within a week of our initial meeting, Catherine had filed all of the necessary paperwork to begin our legal assault. The criminal complaint had been accepted by the district attorney's office, and a detective specializing in financial crimes had been assigned to investigate. The civil lawsuit had been filed in state court, and the emergency motion to freeze assets had been granted by a judge who was clearly shocked by the brazenness of my parents' actions. The asset freeze was the first indication that my parents had seriously underestimated the legal consequences of their scheme. Within 48 hours of the court order, their bank accounts had been frozen, their credit cards had been canceled, and they were unable to access any of the funds they had extracted from my house. My father called me that evening, his voice filled with rage and disbelief. "You've frozen our accounts," he said without preamble. "We can't pay our bills or buy groceries. This is vindictive and cruel." "You stole my house," I replied calmly. "What did you expect would happen?" "We didn't steal anything," he insisted. "We found a legal way to help Marcus, and now you're destroying the family because you're too selfish to accept a reasonable solution." The conversation revealed that my parents still didn't understand the seriousness of what they had done. They continued to view their actions as a creative solution to a family problem rather than a series of serious crimes. They seemed genuinely surprised that I was treating their theft as theft rather than as an overly aggressive intervention. "Drop the lawsuit," my father demanded. "We can work this out as a family without involving lawyers and courts." "No," I said firmly. "You've committed fraud, and you're going to face the consequences." The call ended with my father threatening to, quote, "tell everyone the truth about what kind of person you really are," a threat that no longer carried any weight with me. The people whose opinions mattered to me already knew the truth about my character, and I was no longer concerned about maintaining relationships with people who would support theft and fraud. The forensic investigation that Catherine had initiated began producing results within 2 weeks. The accountant she had hired, a meticulous woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, had uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond the theft of my house. "Your parents have been running financial schemes for years," Dr. Chen explained during a meeting in Catherine's office. "They've been using Marcus's name to obtain credit cards and loans, and they've been systematically transferring assets to avoid taxes and creditors." The investigation revealed that my parents had been living beyond their means for years, funding their lifestyle and Marcus's expenses through a complex web of credit arrangements and asset transfers. They had used Marcus's social security number to apply for credit cards that they controlled, and they had been making minimum payments on these accounts while transferring assets to protect them from potential bankruptcy. "They've been operating a family financial shell game," Dr. Chen continued. The theft of your house was just the latest and most brazen example of their willingness to commit fraud to maintain their lifestyle. The discovery of this broader pattern of financial crimes strengthened our legal position significantly. It demonstrated that my parents' actions weren't an isolated mistake or a misguided attempt to help family members, but rather part of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior. Catherine used this information to expand our legal strategy. We filed additional charges related to the credit card fraud and tax evasion, and we requested that the investigation be expanded to include all of my parents' financial activities over the past 5 years. The pressure on my parents intensified when the district attorney's office decided to pursue criminal charges. A grand jury was convened to review the evidence, and both my parents were formally indicted on charges of mortgage fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The indictment was a turning point in the case. My parents could no longer dismiss the situation as a family dispute that could be resolved through negotiation. They were facing serious criminal charges that could result in substantial prison time, and their assets remained frozen pending the outcome of the civil lawsuit. Marcus called me the day after the indictment was announced. His voice was shaky and desperate in a way I had never heard before. "Rebecca, you have to stop this," he said. "Mom and Dad are talking about taking a plea deal that could send them to prison. This has gone too far." "They committed crimes, Marcus," I replied. "They stole my house and committed fraud. What did you think would happen?" "I thought this was a family matter," he said. "I never imagined it would lead to criminal charges." The conversation revealed that Marcus had been largely unaware of the broader pattern of financial crimes that his parents had been committing. He had assumed that the transfer of my house was an isolated event, and he was shocked to learn about the credit card fraud and tax evasion that had been uncovered during the investigation. "I want to make this right," Marcus said. "What can I do to fix this?" "You can start by moving out of my house," I said, "and you can cooperate with the investigation by providing information about any financial arrangements Mom and Dad made on your behalf." Marcus agreed to both requests, and within a week, he and Jennifer had moved out of my house and into a rental apartment. They also provided Dr. Chen with documentation of all the financial assistance they had received from my parents, which further strengthened our case. The house transfer was formally reversed through a court order that declared the original deed invalid due to the fraudulent use of the power of attorney. I was able to move back into my home, although the process of undoing the refinancing and restoring the property to its original condition would take several more months. But the legal battle was far from over. My parents continued to fight the charges, and their lawyer was attempting to negotiate a plea deal that would minimize their prison time. The civil lawsuit was proceeding separately, and we were seeking not just the return of my property, but also substantial damages for the financial harm and emotional distress I had suffered. The case was also generating significant media attention. Local news outlets had picked up the story of parents who had stolen their daughter's house and given it to their son, and the details of the broader financial fraud had made it a compelling human interest story. "This case represents a new level of family financial abuse," Catherine told a reporter from the Portland Tribune. "The defendants didn't just steal property, they created a complex criminal enterprise designed to benefit one child at the expense of another." The media attention was uncomfortable, but it also served our legal strategy by putting additional pressure on my parents and their lawyer to reach a reasonable settlement. The public exposure of their crimes made it impossible for them to continue portraying themselves as victims of my vindictiveness. As we prepared for the next phase of the legal proceedings, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since returning from Tokyo. The family I had grown up with no longer existed, and I was engaged in a legal battle that would determine not just my financial future, but also the consequences my parents would face for their crimes. What I didn't yet realize was that their biggest mistake wasn't just the theft of my house. It was their assumption that I would be too weak or too loyal to fight back. That miscalculation was about to cost them everything they had worked to build, and it would ultimately destroy the very family they claimed to be protecting. The trial was scheduled for October, 6 months after I had returned from Tokyo to find my life turned upside down. During those months, the investigation had continued to uncover layers of financial manipulation that painted a picture of my parents as sophisticated criminals who had been operating fraudulent schemes for years. Dr. Chen's forensic accounting had revealed that my parents had obtained over $200,000 in fraudulent loans and credit using Marcus's identity, money that had been used to fund their lifestyle and pay for Marcus's wedding and living expenses. They had also been systematically underreporting their income to avoid taxes, hiding cash payments from my father's side consulting work, and failing to report rental income from a property they owned in another state. The evidence was overwhelming, but my parents continued to fight the charges through their attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Robert Sterling who specialized in white-collar crime cases. Sterling's strategy was to portray my parents as loving parents who had made a mistake in trying to help their children, and to minimize the financial crimes as paperwork errors rather than intentional fraud. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Sterling requested a meeting with Catherine and the district attorney's office. He indicated that my parents were interested in discussing a plea agreement that would resolve both the criminal charges and the civil lawsuit. "They're finally realizing how serious this is," Catherine told me as we prepared for the meeting. "The evidence is so strong that they know they'll be convicted if this goes to trial. Their only hope is to negotiate a plea deal that might reduce their prison time." The meeting took place in the district attorney's conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and government-issued furniture that seemed appropriate for discussing the consequences of criminal behavior. My parents sat across from me at the conference table, looking older and more frail than I had ever seen them. Spaceman. The past 6 months had clearly taken a toll on both of them. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and he had lost weight in a way that made his clothes hang loosely on his frame. My mother looked exhausted and defeated, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying regularly. The district attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Martinez, opened the meeting by outlining the charges and the potential sentences my parents were facing. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, you're looking at potential prison sentences of 8 to 12 years each, if convicted on all charges. The federal mortgage fraud charges alone carry a minimum sentence of 5 years. Sterling responded by presenting his client's proposed plea agreement. They would plead guilty to reduced charges, agree to pay full restitution to me, and accept a sentence of 2 years in prison with the possibility of serving the time in a minimum security facility. My clients are elderly and have no prior criminal history," Sterling argued. "They made poor decisions motivated by a desire to help their son, but they're not career criminals who deserve lengthy prison sentences." Catherine rejected the proposal immediately. "Your clients didn't make poor decisions. They committed sophisticated financial crimes over a period of years. They stole a house, committed mortgage fraud, engaged in identity theft, and evaded taxes. 2 years in minimum security is not adequate punishment for these crimes." The negotiation continued for 3 hours, with Sterling gradually increasing the proposed sentence, and Catherine holding firm on her demands for meaningful consequences. Finally, they reached an agreement that satisfied both the criminal and civil aspects of the case. My parents would plead guilty to felony charges of mortgage fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They would be sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years. They would also be required to pay me $850,000 in restitution, representing not just the value of my house and the equity they had stolen, but also damages for the financial harm and emotional distress they had caused. The restitution amount was more than my parents could afford, which meant they would be forced to sell their house and liquidate their retirement savings to pay me. They would emerge from prison with no assets, and would likely need to rely on social services for their basic needs. "This is the consequence of your choices," Catherine told them as they signed the plea agreement. "You gambled with your daughter's future and your own, and you lost everything." My father looked up at me as he signed the documents, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I hope you're satisfied," he said quietly. "You've destroyed your own family." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied. "You destroyed this family when you decided to steal from me. I'm just holding you accountable for your actions." The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. The federal judge, a stern man named Judge William Porter, had clearly reviewed the case materials thoroughly and was not inclined to show leniency to defendants who had committed such brazen crimes. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," Judge Porter said from the bench, "you have committed crimes that strike at the heart of family trust and financial security. You violated the most basic obligations of parenthood by stealing from your own daughter and then attempting to justify your actions as family support." The judge accepted the plea agreement but added additional conditions that my parents hadn't expected. They would be required to participate in financial counseling programs while in prison, and they would be prohibited from managing any financial accounts or making any major financial decisions for 5 years after their release. Your daughter trusted you with emergency powers of attorney, and you used that trust to commit fraud, Judge Porter continued. You have demonstrated that you cannot be trusted with financial responsibilities, and the court will ensure that you cannot harm others in the future. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness at the complete destruction of family relationships that had defined my life for nearly 30 years. Marcus attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Jennifer and their daughter. After the proceedings, he approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I never asked Mom and Dad to steal from you." "I know," I replied. "But you didn't question it either. You moved into my house and accepted the theft because it benefited you." Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I was selfish and entitled. I thought I deserved help because things were harder for me than they were for you. I never considered that you had worked for everything you achieved." The conversation was painful but necessary. Marcus had been shaped by the same family dynamics that had driven me to become independent, but he had learned very different lessons. Where I had learned self-reliance, he had learned to expect support. Where I had learned to work for what I wanted, he had learned to wait for what he felt he deserved. "I want to make things right between us," Marcus said. "I don't know how, but I want to try." "Start by taking responsibility for your own life," I replied. "Stop expecting other people to solve your problems, and start building something for yourself and your family." The restitution payment took 8 months to complete. My parents were forced to sell their house at a loss in a buyer's market, and they had to liquidate their retirement accounts, paying substantial tax penalties in the process. The total amount they could raise was $720,000, which left them $130,000 short of the full restitution amount. Catherine arranged for the remaining balance to be paid through a garnishment of any future income my parents might earn after their release from prison. Given their ages and criminal records, future employment opportunities would be limited, but the legal obligation would remain for the rest of their lives. The financial recovery allowed me to restore my house to its original condition and to rebuild the life that had been disrupted by my parents' crimes. I used part of the restitution to pay off the fraudulent mortgage that had been taken out in my name, and I invested the remainder in a diversified portfolio that would provide long-term financial security. More importantly, I was able to move forward with my life without the constant pressure and manipulation that had characterized my family relationships. David and I had grown closer during the legal battle, and our relationship had strengthened under the stress of the crisis. We married the following spring in a small ceremony attended by friends and colleagues who had supported me through the ordeal. The media attention surrounding the case had unexpected professional benefits. Several technology companies had reached out to me during the trial, impressed by my resilience and my ability to handle a complex crisis while maintaining my professional responsibilities. I received job offers from companies that offered significant salary increases and leadership opportunities. I ultimately accepted a position as a senior systems architect at a startup company in Seattle, a role that would allow me to build technology solutions while also having equity ownership in the company. The move to Seattle also provided a fresh start, away from the memories and associations of Portland. Marcus and Jennifer eventually found their footing as well. The crisis had forced Marcus to confront his own entitlement and to develop the work ethic that had been lacking throughout his life. He took a full-time position as a music teacher at a public school, and Jennifer found work as a social worker. They were able to rent a modest apartment and provide a stable home for their daughter without ongoing family support. The relationship between Marcus and me remained complicated, but it slowly began to heal. We started with occasional phone calls and gradually progressed to visits when I was in Portland on business. The dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the golden child who expected preferential treatment, and I was no longer the daughter who accepted less than I deserved. My parents were released from federal prison after serving 3 years of their sentence. They moved into a small apartment in a government-subsidized housing complex and relied on Social Security and food stamps for their basic needs. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle they had maintained for decades was gone forever, replaced by the economic insecurity they had tried to avoid by stealing from me. I never resumed contact with my parents. The betrayal had been too complete and too calculating to forgive. They had made a deliberate choice to destroy my financial security for Marcus's benefit, and they had shown no genuine remorse for their actions. The relationship I had once hoped to repair was simply too damaged to rebuild. Looking back on the experience 5 years later, I can see how my parents' biggest mistake wasn't just the theft of my house. It was their fundamental misunderstanding of who I had become. They had continued to see me as the dependent daughter who would accept unfair treatment rather than fight back. They had gambled that family loyalty would prevent me from holding them accountable for their crimes. That miscalculation cost them everything: their freedom, their financial security, their relationships with their children, and their reputations in the community. The deed they signed to steal my house had indeed been their biggest mistake, but not because of the legal consequences they faced. It was their biggest mistake because it revealed the true nature of their character and destroyed any possibility of maintaining the family relationships they claimed to value. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who will hurt you most, but it also taught me that the independence and strength I had built over the years were more valuable than any family relationship based on manipulation and control. I had fought for my rights and won, not just in court but in life, and that victory was worth more than any house or any amount of money. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.